Hey guys, Foxdrop here. With patch 6.14 approaching, we are also approaching Rise's third rework. And when you see 3 reworks for 1 champion, you can probably take a pretty good guess that you're seeing less than optimal success with those reworks. In this video today, we're going to be taking a look at Riot's reworking as a whole and answering the question, does Riot suck at reworking champions? This video won't be some kind of really boring history lesson. We're not going to be cataloging every single one of Riot's reworks. It will stay mostly objective, though of course due to the nature of a video like this, there may be some subjective inferences in there as well, but they'll be fairly obvious and shouldn't take away from the video itself. So the first step for answering this question, does Riot suck at reworking champions, we have to determine what defines a successful rework. There are 2 major categories to help us define this, the first of which is the purpose of the rework. And to quote Riot directly, they say the reworks are to deliver a unique, cohesive champion theme, to bring these champions into the modern day, and to have these champions have kits that feel more cohesive overall. Now these quotes somewhat paint a clearer picture, but at the same time they are also somewhat just buzzwords. They don't really mean anything by themselves. Like, by themselves, these phrases don't really have any clear definition either. It's not like we can really look back at a rework and say for sure 100%, oh yeah, this champion now has more of a cohesive hit. Oh yeah, this champion's now been brought to the modern day. This champion now has more of a theme. Even if we feel like we can say these things about the champion reworks, at best they are just subjective. It's someone's opinion. And the second category that helps define whether or not a rework has been successful is the statistical impact of the champion after that rework, specifically with their play rate and their win rate. Basically, after the rework, whether or not a champion has become a useless sack of turds or whether they haven't. But again, even these statistical elements are far from foolproof methods to decide whether or not a champion's rework has been successful. If you take your favorite champion right now, someone you think has been designed really well, and just nerf them into the ground, then their win rates and their play rates would both plummet, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that champion is poorly designed. It just means that he's so nerfed, he's not worth playing. Basically, it just comes down to the 2 sides of champion design, the themes, maybe the aesthetics or the story behind the champion, and then the competitiveness of it, how they feel when they're playing. I would argue that in a game like League of Legends, the latter is more important. Anyway, so now that we have determined what will define a successful rework or not, let's take a look at it in more detail. So for the first category, the more thematical side of things, I actually personally think that Riot has been quite successful, though of course this is somewhat subjective too. Firstly, I find that these rework champions do get much more of an identity that really matches the type of champion that they are thematically. For example, Nidalee is very much more of a predator now, Kassadin's a good skirmishy anti-mage, Fiora's a very strong duelist, that kind of thing. Secondly, there isn't really a rework champion who has an ability that just doesn't feel right on that champion, doesn't really feel like it fits them. On top of that, there also aren't too many of these unintended optimal playstyles that don't really fit the champion. For example, Gragas used to be a glass cannon AP burst mage. Now, if Echo was a reworked champion and not a new champion, I would put him in this category because I don't really think he was ever intended to just be full tank. Don't really think that fits him. But he's not a reworked champion, so he gets off the hook for now. And whereas I think that Riot's pretty good on that front, I do also think that there are some exceptions, specifically with the Juggernaut updates. Now, Skarner and Mordekaiser from this update are arguably the 2 champions who've received the highest unique themes, but in my opinion, they're just too much. Like Skarner's little catchable pillars and Mordekaiser's pet ghost, to be honest, it just feels really out of place for League in general as a game. And I think to that extent, it just goes a little bit too far. That's not even including the fact that, just from a gameplay standard, it's just very odd as well. So that's the first category, the thematical one. What about the second one, the statistical perspective? Well, in general, the reworks are actually fairly balanced. When they first come out, they may be quite OP, but that's somewhat hard to avoid if you think about new champion releases as well. It's just really hard to release a champion that's perfectly balanced in the game. Some examples of that would be like Darius, Poppy and Fiora on their release. They were just ridiculously broken. However, all of the recently reworked champions, this includes the Marksman update, the Juggernaut update, the Mage update, plus a few extra on the side that were just updated by themselves. All of them now, all of these champions together, their average win ratios is pretty much dead on 50%. Now this is accurate as of patch 6.13, however I will say that it's actually really hard to draw any statistical conclusions from this, because depending on when you gather this data will heavily influence what the win rates are. For example, Fury and Poppy, like I said before, came out very strong, but right now they're both sitting at below 50%. As for pick rate, i.e. how much they actually get played, they tend to fluctuate quite a lot. Some champions like Mordekaiser will be seen 1 every 200 games, but some champions like Graves you'll be seeing 1 every 4. On average as well, whenever someone's picking a champion, there is roughly a 20% chance that that champ will be someone that was reworked recently. And on average, these champions have a 4.5% pick rate. Don't get confused though, that doesn't mean that you're going to see a reworked champion in 4.5% of your games. And again, just like the win rates, it's hard to draw too many statistical conclusions from this data because it varies quite a lot depending on who's popular, who's in meta, who's winning, that kind of thing. For example, if a champion is very much in meta, they're very strong right now, then the chances of them being picked are, surprise, surprise, a lot higher. And of course, in the same coin, if someone's really not very strong right now, the chances of them being picked are even lower. But then you do have champions that fly under the radar quite a lot, like Skarner recently reworked. He only gets picked in around 2% of games, but his win rate is the second highest among all junglers. Now, generally speaking, if a champion is not being played at all, then you can probably determine that that champion is really just not fun to play, not worth playing, and a bit of a failure. You could also argue that someone who's very strong, like the Skarner that I just mentioned with a very high win rate, isn't being picked a lot because he's just not a fun champion to play, because his design is just a little bit weird and therefore his rework wasn't too successful. However, you could also argue that that might be because you never see Skarner in professional play either. He doesn't get a lot of exposure, who knows. But generally speaking, from a statistical point of view, the reworks do tend to produce these healthy champions, as much as you can put any weight on that word healthy. Champions basically that aren't either really busted or really useless. I think the biggest exception to this is probably only Mordekaiser, who in my opinion is a champion that whenever he's viable, he's just too strong, and if he's not viable, then he's pretty much just not strong enough. However, I also feel, and this is just my opinion, that there are some reworks that don't really address the issues that made the champions either oppressive or clunky and outdated or maybe unhealthy. Basically, there are a few champions who got reworked where it just makes you feel like, well, what was the point? They're kind of just the same as they were before. For example, in my opinion, people like Ryze, Soraka, Kog'Maw, Vladimir, Rengar, Malzahar, these are all champions that got reworked, but it didn't really address their like unhealthy or oppressive kit playstyle, their kind of nature. And people like Skarner and Garen are champions who got reworked but really just feel still clunky, outdated, and not changed much in that regard. So generally speaking, to answer the question put forth in the beginning of this video, does Riot suck at reworks? Personally, in my opinion, I actually think that Riot does a fairly good job across the board. There are obviously some examples which really just weren't very good. I actually think the Juggernaut update as a whole was just terrible, but to be honest, overall, these reworks are not too bad. So what do you think about Riot and their reworks? Do you think I'm wrong in some of my conclusions? Do you think that some of these champions that were reworked are just terrible, or they're all terrible and you hate Riot? Tell me what you think down below in the comments. If you liked this video, of course, feel free to chuck a cheeky like down below, and if you didn't like it, then, you know, dislike button is there as well. Don't be afraid to use it. It lets me know whether or not I've done a good job and whether you appreciate this kind of content, or whether, you know, I should just shut up and stick to what I usually do. You can find me on Facebook, on Twitter, catch me streaming at twitch.tv/Foxdrop. All those links are down below in the description. But most importantly, guys, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you in my next video.